I am excited on behalf of the University of Rochester Library, the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, to bring definitely a friend of the library to us this morning to talk about cultural humility. And just a couple of notes. So this is our diversity and inclusion, library's diversity and inclusion webpage. Not sure what that's going to look like as the website gets redeveloped and redesigned, but I have put a plug in that it is important that we retain the information and the stuff that we do. I'm just going to scroll up a little bit or down. And it has our diversity statement on it, and the committee is really passionate about the work, the programming that we put together to keep the matters of diversity, equity, and inclusion in front of the library staff as we build awareness. And the diversity statement, it says very quickly, the University of Rochester Library is committed to supporting a diverse and inclusive environment for students, staff, and faculty. The libraries encourage, support, and celebrate people of all races, places of origin, people with disabilities, people of diverse sexualities and gender identities, and the most vulnerable in our community. Our libraries are promoted as a safe space to learn, discover, heal, create, and make the world ever better for all. So with that being said, that's our mission and our statement and how we work. Last year at this time, we brought Mark Puente. He gave us kind of a baseline and framework for unconscious bias and some language, shared language that we can use. We did a quick survey, a brief survey after his visit, and the responses really from all of you really talked about how we wanted to dig deeper and how do we mitigate unconscious bias. So following up on the mandated unconscious bias report that we had to do last fall, we decided as a committee that we would take your advice, dig a little deeper, and address how do we confront unconscious bias. So that brings us to our speaker today for this year's series is Dr. Kristen Hawker. And she's going to talk about cultural humility. Again, Dr. Hawker is a friend of the library. She used to work over in the Staff Diversity and Inclusion Office, but is now a member and faculty in the School of Nursing. So we're happy to still have her expertise in-house, that's for sure. So join me in welcoming Dr. Hawker.
All right, I just had to do a little technological cheer. It's like, yay, I did it. Although I was still thrilled when I came in and I had Pete's help. And for years and years and years, I think 13 years that I've worked here, I've always asked for like a presentation roadie. And he's like, you want me to click things for you? You want me to? I'm like, oh my God, do I have a roadie now? So this is like a dream come true. And I also want to acknowledge people streaming. Hi, I hope that you're able to access me. And I just want to let you all know that this is going to be an interactive presentation. So when I announce those parts, I'll also announce the time in which people will be talking in pairs. There'll be questions on the screen, and you should also have the slides with the questions. So you can take a bathroom break. You can write your responses. If you have somebody sitting next to you, you can talk to them. So just a way for you also to be able to engage in the interactive manner of this presentation. So I just want to extend my thanks and my gratitude to Myra for inviting me along to do this presentation, for Marianne and just her tireless effort in championing diversity and inclusion as practice within your organization. As Myra mentioned, I'm a friend of the library, and I was kind of grinning to myself because I thought that might be like that I could get away with library fees and overdue books, but actually it means that I've been here before doing similar presentations for the library, and I see some familiar faces, and I also see familiar faces from running groups and other aspects of the community, but I see some familiar faces from past presentations that I've done. So the commitment is very apparent. It's been, established and grounded here, and you don't get there unless you have leadership who's dedicated and committed to that. And so again, I want to commend Marianne and Myra on that aspect, as well as the members of the committee. Something else I want to do, I want to make sure to acknowledge that we are having this event on the traditional territory of the nation of the Haudenosaunee, who are the traditional stewards as well as the current stewards of this land. Something I feel is important to acknowledge, especially in light of, if any of you had a chance to go hear Angela Davis on, when was that, Wednesday, Tuesday? Oh, it was just such an amazing blur. I think I was just like, forgot the rest of the days of the week after that. And one of the things that she mentioned is the importance for us to snap out of our historical amnesia, and specifically as institutions with commitments to diversity and inclusion. A part of that is recognizing their institutional amnesia. And one of that is deeply rooted in the erasure of our Indigenous and First Nations people whose land we occupy. And so it's always important for us to make sure that we give that acknowledgement. We recognize their presence, their existence, and their significance and relevance to our history as an institution. So with that being said, one of the things I like to do is kind of talk about how I came to do this presentation of cultural humility. And this came from a partnership and also a little piece of my own history. I mentioned I do, as Myra said, I was once a part of organizational development staff diversity. And I would often, in kind of the beginning part of my career, get called in to do what was called the diversity talk, right? And it was one of these kind of amalgamous talks that was just like, diversity is these range of differences. And it just seems pretty bland. But it was one of those things where I kind of inherited and just kind of rolled with it up until I did one of those talks for another group, and noticed that the moment that I started really talking about race, and the minute I started talking about racism, people started getting defensive, they started getting uncomfortable, right? And it was just kind of one of these things where like, why are we talking about race? This is supposed to be about diversity. And I'm like, really? Right? And so I got a call to do one of the diversity talks with a friend, a dear friend of mine, somebody who was also a friend of the library, which is Kit Miller, who's the director of the Gandhi Institute. And she and I were talking about what do we want to do and how do we want to frame this. One of the things that she said, you know how somebody speaks something, some truth to you that has been sitting in your gut for a long time? And one of the things that she said was, I'm really tired of doing this diversity talk when we really need to be talking about race and racism, when we really need to be naming these isms and schisms for what they are, and people's existence for how it exists, and people's identities, right? And the criticality of that conversation. And as she spoke that, I was like, thank you, right? It felt like it was giving light to something I've been feeling for many years and getting tired of doing. And so what happened is after that, kind of in that pursuit and doing some research, I stumbled upon this video that I'll show you later about cultural humility, and learning more about it and learning about how the framework moves away from that, moves away from this notion of masking to really rooting ourselves within the discomfort of having conversations that deal with our historical amnesia around racism, around really identifying why race is important to discuss, why homophobia, heterosexism, transphobia, biphobia is critical to discuss, and how when we, again, make these commitments to diversity and inclusion, we really have to think about what are we practicing? What are we doing? How are we embodying that? And so what I recognize is there's also a way to acknowledge the discomfort, knowing that we get split when we have these conversations, we get split within an old paradigm. And that old paradigm might bring up, but if I talk about racism, somebody's going to accuse me of being racist. If I talk about implicit bias, somebody's going to accuse me of being biased. That means I'm a bad person. That means I can never show my face ever again, right? And so, or even people might think that, I assume or have assumptions about me in these ways. And so part of this conversation is also moving into a different paradigm, shifting into a different paradigm. One that just acknowledges that when we talk about prejudice and biased thoughts and actions, we're really having to acknowledge that by existence in this country, by existence in the frameworks that as that systemic, historically, we all have it. We've all caught on to biased and prejudiced thoughts and existences. And the idea is that if we have to recognize how they may have framed habits. So not just habits of thought, but habits of action. What comes up for us in a way that we haven't acknowledged? That once we step back and do that reflection and say, why am I behaving in this way? Why am I reacting to this person this way? But they require more than just wanting to be good people and wanting us to have good reflection or good intentions. They really require us to think deeply about how do we shift knowledge, how do we expand upon our knowledge, and how do we recognize that there's a whole world out there that we don't even know. There's a whole bunch of existence that we don't know. And stepping towards that means that we can start to unlearn some behaviors and really ground ourselves in who are we being to each other? How are we being to each other? That goes beyond these isms and schisms, but really opens up to this idea of inclusion as practice. Not just as an institutional level, but also on my individual level, contributing to this institution. Right? So we framed this in two parts. And the first part is framed around this video. How many of you are familiar with Imbalances? You're librarians, so I'm hoping everybody would raise their hands. So she's a Nigerian author. She wrote, I think her recent book is Americana. She also wrote a book called Competence. There's another book about a yellow sun that I just can't recall the full title to. But say that again. Half a yellow sun. Thank you very much. So she does this great TED talk about the danger of a single story. And we're going to watch a piece of this. But what I'm going to ask you to reflect afterwards, and again, these are the things, the interactive parts that I was talking about for those who are streaming. To take a moment to reflect on what feels important as you listen to her talk about the danger of a single story. Oops. What are some single stories that you yourself have had to challenge? So what's that stuff that pops up, that trickles up for you that you didn't even recognize, but maybe all of a sudden you did and you had to challenge that? You had to say, wait a minute, why am I going in that direction? And what are some single stories that may have been about your own identities that, again, you've had to challenge or deconstruct? All right. And how have you advocated for your own authenticity? And that might make sense once you see your video. All right. So my roadie is going to help cue up the video. Thank you.
Of the single story. I grew up on a university campus.
I'm a storyteller, and so I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in Eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer. And when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria, had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow, we ate mangoes, and we never talked about the weather because there was heat. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books. But because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamara Laye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination, they opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this. It saved me from having a single story of what books are. I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape to Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this. She had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me as an African was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. I must say that before I went to the US, I didn't consciously identify as African. But in the US, whenever Africa came up, people turned to me, never mind that I knew nothing about places like Namibia. But I did come to embrace this new identity, and in many ways, I think of myself now as African. Although I still get quite irritable when Africa is referred to as a country, the most recent example being my otherwise wonderful flight from Lagos 2 days ago, in which there was an announcement on the Virgin flight about the charity walk in India, Africa, and other countries. So after I had spent some years in the US as an African, I began to understand my roommate's response to me. If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind, white foreigner. I would see Africans in the same way that I, as a child, had seen Fide's family. This single story of Africa ultimately comes, I think, from Western literature. Here's a quote from the writing of a London merchant called John Locke, who sailed to West Africa in 1561 and kept a fascinating account of his voyage. After referring to the black Africans as beasts who have no houses, he writes, "They are also people without heads, having their mouths and eyes in their breasts." Now, I've laughed every time I've read this, and one must admire the imagination of John Locke. But what is important about his writing is that it represents the beginning of a tradition of telling African stories in the West, a tradition of sub-Saharan Africa as a place of negatives, of difference, of darkness, of people who, in the words of the wonderful poet Rudyard Kipling, are half devil, half child. And so I began to realize that my American roommate must have, throughout her life, seen and heard different versions of this single story. As had a professor who once told me that my novel was not authentically African. Now, I was quite willing to contend that there were a number of things wrong with the novel, that it had failed in a number of cases, but I had not quite imagined that it had failed at achieving something called African authenticity. In fact, I did not know what African authenticity was. The professor told me that my characters were too much like him, an educated and middle-class man. My characters drove cars. They were not starving. Therefore, they were not authentically African. But I must quickly add that I too am just as guilty on the question of the single story. A few years ago, I visited Mexico from the US. The political climate in the US at the time was tense, and there were debates going on about immigration. And, as often happens in America, immigration became synonymous with Mexicans. There were endless stories of Mexicans as people who were fleecing the healthcare system, sneaking across the border, being arrested at the border, that sort of thing. I remember walking around on my first day in Guadalajara, watching the people going to work, rolling up tortillas in the marketplace, smoking, laughing. I remember first feeling slight surprise, and then I was overwhelmed with shame. I realized that I had been so immersed in the media coverage of Mexicans that they had become one thing in my mind, the abject immigrant. I had bought into the single story of Mexicans, and I could not have been more ashamed of myself. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become.
What feels important to understand about how she described?
It is impossible to talk about the single.
What are some single stories that you've had to challenge? And what are some single stories about your own identities that you've had to unlearn? And how have you reclaimed your own authenticity? What I ask you to do is find a partner, however, I don't discriminate how many numbers you want to join, and take 5 minutes to discuss the questions. And for those of you who are streaming, this is your bathroom break, but if you also want to answer on your own, please feel free. All right. So what came up for you? What felt important as you listened to Chimamanda Adichie talk about the danger of a single story? What felt important for you? What stood out? Please. Actually, hang on. I just realized. Yep, mic check. That's how Myra's going to get her steps in.
What I liked and noticed was that she first looked into herself and then told the story. So thinking very much about what we're doing gives you, I think, a little more, not right, more insight into what's happening with other people. So it isn't they're just bad, but really thinking about what have I done, what single story have I seen, what single stories do I know? And I think it gives a better framework. So I really like that method of approaching it.
Yeah, well said.
I was going to say it was just really striking to hear sort of how insidious stories are, right? Mm-hmm. How if you don't take the time to reflect and think about them, they just sort of wash over you. Like, that's just the way the world is. And that was a really, I think, powerful thing to have articulated so well.
Yeah, that's why I often speak of these ideas and ideologies. And so I'll use racism as a kind of catch-all. So I was just sharing with Pete, one of the most prolific books that I've read is Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi. It's like one of those things I kind of proselytize it because I tell anybody who'll listen to me about this book. But something that, as he writes about this kind of ideological definitive history of racism in the US. And one of the things that I found was like very interesting, specifically now as we're celebrating Frederick Douglass, right? And, this prolific anti-racist abolitionist hero. And then he starts to talk about Frederick Douglass's writings and speeches, and something that was a bit challenging was recognizing that he also had challenging notions around indigenous and native people, which he would refer to as savages. And so one could just be like, okay, I'm just going to burn everything by Frederick Douglass and dismiss him as a historical figure, right? Or you can start to recognize, where did he get that from? And so, when you start to embed people within the time and the context and the associations, and you start to realize that, and so the way I kind of translate this to our own personal experiences is to think of ourselves at our kitchen table. What do we pick up as kids? When Aunt so-and-so or Uncle so-and-so would come by, or Grandma and Grandpa, right? And what would come out of their mouths? Or what was the kind of conversation that would happen? Or maybe somebody would kind of quietly shush them. But did they ever stand up and radically say, that's not right? Or if they did, how did we learn that? Right? And what do we learn from that? So we all pick this up. And up until we start doing this reflection, because maybe somebody along our ways said, I don't know if you know this, but that joke you said, that's not funny. And this is how it lands, right? Or that word you said actually has a different context for this group over here. And they don't feel comfortable about that. And we go, oh, we can either go, oh, or we can be like, that's not what I meant, right? I would hope that were Frederick Douglass still alive, he would say, wow, I didn't think about that, right? Because if he said, that's not what I meant, God, we'd be so disappointed. Right? What else? What else stood out to you about the danger of a single story? Go ahead. In the yellow, and then the person in the brown sweater.
Single stories tend to be very reductionist, and people and cultures are much more complex than just a single trait or small handful of traits.
Absolutely right. Yeah, very reductionist, right? So that's the whole danger of it, right? That's kind of that warning sign of you're reducing people to just a single element or a single behavioral trait, right? And encapsulating that among all people, right? And then how does an individual break free of that? Yeah. Hang on, leave for the mic if you would.
There were so many. It was such a great video. I really appreciate it. I'm going to share it with other people too. So one thing that kind of personally resonated, kind of related to the larger sort of political tension scene, a personal experience that I had, because I'm not sure, what your thoughts are on this, but I'd really be interested in hearing. So last summer, my wife and I went out with a cousin of hers and her husband, and we and pretty much everybody in our circles are called progressive left, whatever. And we know that her relatives are conservative, and we're just having lunch, having a nice time as family. And I was generally curious, so them I said, what do you think of the new president so far? And he got very angry just at the question. And I'm reflecting about it, I think it was because he associated with, if he started talking about why he liked the current president, he would be seen as racist. And he didn't want, whether he was or was not, he didn't want to be, I don't think he is, but he might be, I have no idea. He didn't want to be painted as that bad person. So, and I know, I get the sense that that is sort of happening to some degree right now. And I'm not quite sure, how to best approach, let's say, because you can talk about, like, here's how to have a good dialogue, respect, but if you can't even open up the dialogue because the person already is afraid of saying something because they think they're going to be seen as a because that's a single story, let's say, that maybe a lot of, I'll say us here, because I think a lot of people in this room have that. How do you not even bother opening up a conversation because it's already too painful for say that's their single story. I'm a bad person. I must be a racist because there are things I like about this president.
Sure. Huh. So what I've been doing, and it's not been engaging in conversations, but, and that's why I bring up Kennedy's work as one aspect. And I'm trying to recall what I was thinking about as you were talking. There was something else that I was, so towards the end of, so I talked, this is definitive history. And so there's another book that I picked up at the end of that. And it's Paul Leclerc, Black Liberation and the American Dream. And another book that I'll drop as well. I feel so comfortable in front of the librarians. It's like, yeah, I'm just gonna drop all these books, right? Is Christopher Newfield's The Unmaking of the Public University. The reason why I mention these is because I feel that history is so extraordinarily important. And it's kind of opened up my eyes into not just the individual, but what's this ideology that has clouded the current political structure, right? And a lot of that is the stuff that we don't know or we don't understand to some extent. So I personally don't understand conservatism. I don't understand it as an ideological structure. I don't understand it, how it started. I don't understand its roots. And I think that's important to ask, because then I wonder for myself, if I were to engage in a conversation, instead of just putting it on this individual as president, how do you then start talking about the system in which he's immersed and the system in which other people who conscribe to that ideology are also immersed? So I would be interested in talking about the economist. He's a Nobel Prize winning economist named Milton Friedman, who is tremendously responsible for the economic grounding that rooted a lot of Reagan's policies, a lot of, I believe, Nixon's policies. The fact that, something I've been really tremendously interested is the rise of this idea of the war on drugs in contribution to this opioid epidemic. So I think a lot of times we don't have conversations around the issues that we're facing and the dichotomies around those issues. So just and instead we tend to have this like attacking of our personhood immersed in these, right? And then sometimes we don't even know, like, why are we getting attacked? So like the whole idea of like calling leftist people as snowflakes and stuff like that. It's like, where do we get there, right? Because then it means we still remain ignorant into what are the issues that we are on opposite ends of. And then where do we find some convergence within that or some understanding? I think what was powerful for me, and I spent 18 years out in West Bloomfield, New York, which is 35 minutes outside of the city. You're laughing, so you know where it is, right? All right. Yeah, I'm looking at you like, you might be familiar. And so that was, and I'm from New York City originally, so that was like, woo, right? I was really out of my element. But then we started joining the church and all this kind of stuff, and I got involved in the church in some capacity, and had a conversation with somebody who was a small business owner in Bloomfield who had a conservative viewpoint, and this is at the time of Obama, right? So I was like, I was pro-Obama up until his problematic world policies, right? But at that time, we were having this conversation about, what does this mean for you as a small business owner? What does this mean for your account? Because then it's helped me to understand that's a different perspective. That's why he was definitely, I think he was like Ron Paul or something like that. And I was like, well, that's interesting. Tell me about that, right? So I think, and this is a perfect segue. I'm also paying attention time, how much time I have, but it's a perfect segue to why cultural humility, why this is cornered with cultural humility. And some of you have already hinted towards that, in this idea of how do we engage within a critical self-reflection and realize that this is lifelong, that our ability to understand beyond our own histories, beyond our own stories, takes a lot of unpacking and a lot of courageous learning. Asking the question of how many people have read Chimamanda Adichie is an intentional question, because it really asks, how many times do we read authors who are beyond our scope of our existence and other stories of other existences? So how many of us know other stories that exist around the nations of Africa that go beyond how Africa is portrayed to us? Africa as a continent, Africa or different nations. How many of us have actually pursued Nollywood films and Nollywood shows to see the nuance of how people interact and engage, and the fact that, this isn't just about poverty and war and AIDS. I got into a really cool conversation with a friend of mine about this obscure show that I found on Netflix, which is, it's a Turkish historical show, and it's, I'm blanking out on the name, but it's about this like Turkish historical figure. And one of the things he was asking me, he goes, have you ever seen Muslim prayer? Because he was kind of sharing with me how it's like almost a physical activity. And before I could say, I said, wait a minute, before I answer this, let me give you the context in which I've seen this. And so we started talking about this scene from this show about how Muslim prayer was demonstrated in a way that I said it reminded me of the Sufism, and just like telling him how it was this full body experience. And it was like a really profound conversation. But it just got, something about, I'm curious about this. Let me see what this is about. And learning something outside of oneself. It's important to recognize that why we talk about single stories, and you can transplant single stories for implicit bias or unconscious bias. But we're talking about this information that gets encapsulated, right? So the idea of when I'm saying, where do people get these informations and this ideology from? How do they get immersed? How do they get embedded? And why do they enact them is another question. Sometimes we get so caught up in why are they enacting this that we forget that they're ingrained with mutual information. They've been at a different kitchen table hearing this stuff. And it creates meaning. It structures meaning. Milton Friedman, I bring him up as an economist because the same that Chimamanda Adichie is talking about John Locke writing about Africans as beasts with no houses, translated in, whenever Milton Friedman was writing as Black people have no value for their communities, which translated into broken window policies, which are leading up to the same prison to pipeline situations that we have now. So we really do have to look into the ideological structures of our thinking, because they have an embedded meaning that can translate into our actions as well as our policies, that can inform our institutional ongoings unless we challenge them and change them. And a lot of that is recognizing that the world in which we're born is only one model of reality. How do we start to know the other models of reality? How do we start to understand the other stories that exist, that they are unique manifestations of those individuals' human spirit? And that's where we can start to see people for their authenticity and embrace people's authenticity, right? Not to see them as the opposite of us, not to think of them as needing to assimilate within us, but how do they become a part and valued for their own authentic identities within our same spaces, our mutual spaces, contributing in their own unique ways. And so this is what leads to the conversation around cultural humility. I won't give you too much of a history lesson on this one, but just you'll hear from Doctors Melanie Turbalon and Jean-Marie Garcia in the second clip about how they framed cultural humility and what prompted them to frame this philosophy, this working philosophy. But the gentleman I mentioned initiated this in a way of understanding what students were experiencing when they would go to their different countries where they were assigned through Peace Corps. So how did they get immersed within those different cultures? I just want to highlight that there are 3 tenets to cultural humility. So this first piece I've been speaking to and some of you already mentioned, was the critical self-reflection and lifelong learning. So again, checking into those dominant narratives, really understanding the single stories that we've inherited and how those single stories impact our beliefs and our actions, right? So this is really thinking about how do we change those habits and start to recognize something different. This also entails challenging power imbalances. So once we recognize our own privilege and how our privilege informs our own positioning in power or our own positioning as rank, how might we disrupt that, right? How might we start thinking collaboratively? How might we start looking at people from how can we learn from them instead of teaching to them, right? So it really changes our own positionality in the world, as well as when we think about institutions. So this last piece about institutional accountability. Again, one of the things I mentioned about is when we think about inclusion as practice, as an institution, how do we start committing that cultural humility framework to really drive our notions of inclusion? That we are as an institution becoming critically self-reflection. And that we as an institution, we are also really questioning and challenging our power imbalances, right? Our hierarchical systems working with us or working against us? And if they are, how might we make shift between our own privilege and recognizing that the difference between rank being a medicine or rank being a drug? And that's a little quote from Arnold Mendel. So what I'm going to show you next, move out my roadie's way. What I'm going to show you next is a small clip snippet from about cultural humility from Drs. Melanie Tervalon and Jean-Marie Garcia. Again, there are going to be some questions that I'll pose to you after, similar to when we talked about the danger of a single story, thinking about what's important to you, how do you understand cultural humility? Think about, have you ever seen the tenets in action? So have you seen or encountered someone who's critically self-reflective, someone who's a lifelong learner, someone who does ask these deep questions, someone who does unpack power imbalances or challenge power imbalances and recognizes them when they occur? And then the most important question that I would love to leave you with and have you reflect upon is, what's one thing that you're willing to do to begin practicing cultural humility? What's something that you're willing to try? Okay.
One word to describe.
One word to describe cultural humility for me is love, actually.
If I had to encapsulate cultural humility, or the whole concepts of cultural humility, it doesn't do it justice, but the word that I think of it is essence.
Escuchar.
Being. You.
Opening.
Receive. Compassion.
Love.
The principles of cultural humility offer one more framework to contribute to what has got to be our ultimate goal, yes? Our ultimate goal is that there will be a sense of equity, a sense of equality, and a kind of respect that we are driving forward.
Cultural humility is a multi-dimensional concept, and certainly Melanie Tervalon and I conceptualized 3 dimensions.
The first is lifelong learning and critical self-reflection. And in that critical self-reflection, it is the understanding of how each of us, every single one of us, is a complicated, multidimensional human being. Each of us comes with our own histories and stories, our heritage, our point of view. You're looking at me now. I am very fair-skinned. When I was a little girl, my hair was blonde. My eyes are blue. People often tried to call me anything but African American. I have a history. My identity is rooted in that history. My parents gave me the knowledge of my own social identity, and my own experience in life has created that. I get to say who I am.
The second tenet, after self-reflection and ongoing lifelong learning and development, is this notion that we must mitigate the power imbalances, to recognize and mitigate the power imbalances that are inherent often in our clinician patient or clinician client or service provider community dynamics.
And then finally, the piece that I would offer that Jan and I feel people often either don't read or don't like, which is, and the institution has to model these principles as well.
An African-American nurse is caring for a middle-aged Latina woman several hours after the patient had undergone surgery. A Latino physician on a consult service approached the bedside and, noting the moaning patient, commented to the nurse that the patient appeared to be in a great deal of post-operative pain. The nurse summarily dismissed his perception, informing him that she took a course in nursing school in cross-cultural medicine and knew that Hispanic patients overexpress the pain that they're feeling. The Latino physician had a difficult time influencing the perspective of this nurse, who focused on her self-proclaimed cultural expertise.
It was curious to this Latino physician who, first of all, was Latino, not like all, in his case, not like all Mexican Americans know everything there is to know about Mexican American patients. That wasn't it, but he might have been a resource for that African American nurse in that moment that she didn't feel like she needed, again, because she had bought into this notion of competence, of cultural competence.
The distinction between cultural humility and cultural competence was that we were in a process and a relationship that had many other layers to it, and that we were less comfortable with even the term of competence, in a way that I think people understand well, and that it implies, especially for people who are providers and are trained in academia, that you are then all-knowing and all-powerful. And we felt like that was not what was happening for us as we were learning from community and understanding in a very practical way how families were coming to the hospital and feeling as if they really were not being heard from their own heritage and history, and how that impacted what they came to the hospital with that we didn't know anything about, hadn't even a clue about. For us, this is part of the humility piece of it, getting to understand that, not trying to humiliate you, not trying to make you feel bad, trying to help us all understand that life is like this, and to, in a certain sense, be really happy about not knowing.
In April of 1992, in the wake of the Los Angeles riots, following the initial not guilty verdict of the police officers accused of beating Mr. King, the Children's Hospital Oakland community was compelled to meet in a series of highly charged sessions to expose and critique our own patterns of institutional racism, injustice, and inequity. My name is Dr. Melanie Turvalon, and I am Director of Multicultural Affairs here at Children's Hospital Oakland.
I want to thank everybody for coming to what is a celebration for me of this year.
Jan and I had the good fortune, really, to be together in the same place.
So what they did in practice was they held a series of sessions in which they invited community members to come and inform physicians and practitioners at Children's Oakland Hospital about what their care meant. What did it mean to actually see them as human beings, to actually care for them in their full personhood? Because what they were telling Dr. Turvalon and Maria Garcia was that what they were experiencing was their own personal Rodney Kings. and that they just felt like they were just being ignored or being seen for just the single story in which the practitioner had in their mind. So I wanted to give you just a sense and how they established this framework and the importance and relevance of this framework. So hopefully this gives you an opportunity to think about what makes sense to you about cultural humility. Has there anybody seen or thought about the tenets in action? Has anybody seen or been witness to people who are critically self-reflective, lifelong learners? Would you mind just sharing a quick story? Who and what you've seen? Hang on. Myra's coming with the mic.
I'm thinking about just a few older folks that I know that are just, they always seem to be, they're not just senior citizens that sort of sit at home and watch TV. They're always getting out and about, and they're always going to all different types of things. And I see them in all different types of events and different cultural events and different talks and things. And I think there's a few of them that I can think of that I think, wow, this is somebody who really sort of cares about self-improvement, even after, we would sort of, most the culture would consider, they're kind of done with their life. They could relax and just, stay home. So there's a few people that have, I've always looked to and thought, oh, this is really inspiring to see, these folks sort of continuing to embrace life.
Yeah. Interesting how it also challenges our own notion of what an elder should be, right? Or how an elder should be. My mom's taking classes at a local college. She was taking French classes initially. Now she's taking a class on photography. I'm like, go ahead, Mom. She's 72 years old, right? And it's like totally different, changing the paradigm of what an elder should be. So what are ways that you think about practicing cultural humility? What are some of the ideas that you have? And what's one thing that you're willing to try? I could take maybe one or two ideas.
So there's a thing called the Book Riot Challenge, and it's every year they post a list of how to break out of your comfort zone. So read someone from a Central American nation, read science fiction, read an LGBTQ friendly, read a play, by someone who's not in your cultural group, read something by somebody who's younger, who's older, who's this. And so I try every year to look for those books and read them. That's how I don't think that's how I got Americana, but since then I read more of Adichie's work, and that led me to more. And so once you find that, oh my gosh, this is a great story, I want more like this, all of a sudden there's lots of lists out there too. So it can be movies, it can be those things. So I think that's a really painless way to start. The diversity inclusion group, we're all reading a book called Waking Up White, and that is a challenging way because you have to look at yourself and kind of do that. I feel shame. I have to work through this, because you can't just stop because it feels bad. You have to work through that. And on the other side of feeling bad, you're going to be a little bit better. So.
And there too. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Anything else? Anyone else? Thinking about how else are you going to practice cultural humility? What's one thing that you're willing to try? Over here? Okay.
One thing I found is really helpful is to take myself out of the position of always feeling like I should be an expert in things. So trying to create environments where in acknowledging how much power I typically have in a room, put myself in a position to experience not necessarily disempowerment, but the discomfort, right, that is necessary for real learning and real understanding of different perspectives. So recently I've started trying to learn to speak Spanish for like the third or fourth time, right? And it's really crucial, I think, to sometimes relinquish the power so that you begin to have a better perspective on where power lives.
Mm-hmm. The three most uncomfortable words, right? Yo no sé, or I don't know. Yeah.
I've been struggling with how to make sure that when I'm coming into a classroom, I'm coming in from a place of cultural inclusion, cultural humility. And I think that one of the things that I have been determined to do going forward is fold more of those best practices into the classroom when I walk in.
Mm-hmm.
I have been guilty of looking for the spokesperson. And I've been really reflective of and sensitive to not making someone be the spokesperson for the entire culture or a sub part of a culture when we're having conversations. So that's one of the things that I've been trying to do.
Yeah. If you're interested, there's a scholar named Bianca Williams who incorporates what's called radical honesty into her pedagogy. And so she does a beautiful opening where she just talks about all her identities to the class and what's her intention of grounding those. And one of the things that I always speak to is opening up as a community of scholars, right? So I asked, how are we going to be a community of scholars in this room? And then the other thing is how do you drop questions that might be cultural questions that don't get directed to one person, that get directed to the rest of the room, and really opening it up so that nobody has to feel like they're the expert. And if nobody knows, then nobody knows, and say, okay, maybe that's something that we all have to explore, right? So it's just that's a great stance, right? To recognize our own positionality, but I think it's also how do we open it up to our own positionality and let our students in on that, right? Because then that could be a connector. But she also says, I get curious as to which students might not show up ever again after I do that, right? And then sometimes that's on them, right? I mean, are they willing and able to take that information and process that and do their own critical self-reflection? Right? Bianca Williams. Yep. So I'm 3 minutes over, and I just want to respect the time that you have today. But I'm again just so grateful to Myra, grateful to Marianne, grateful to the Diversity and Inclusion Committee here, grateful to all of you for all the time and energy that you allowed me to share with you today, and that you shared with me. Last quote I'm going to put up just for your own reading and perusing as you walk out is from one of my great philosophers, Jiddu Krishnamurti. I just think it's a great charge for how do we reconnect on a level of our humanness that can be dynamic and that can shift us as a world from where we've been functioning before. So thank you again.